on this edition of the Self-Publishing Show.
Like, wow, I'm surprised we don't talk more about this, because it is such a critical thing we can do in order to pull the reader into this journey we want to take them on.
Publishing is changing. No more gatekeepers, no more barriers, no one standing between you and your readers. Do you want to make a living from your writing? Join indie bestseller Mark Dawson and first-time author James Blatch as they shine a light on the secrets of self-publishing success. This is the Self-Publishing Show. There's never been a better time to be a writer.
Hello and welcome. It is the Self-Publishing Show with me, James Blatch.
And me, Mark Dawson.
Hello, Mark Dawson. How are you? Have you had a lovely week since we spoke last week?
Well, we're recording this in the past, so I will have been on holiday, and you will have been on holiday as well. So yeah, who knows? Hopefully, in fact, we'll have been back a week, so we'll have forgotten about our holidays, and we'll be back into work mode again. Probably wanting another holiday.
We might still be drunk from England winning the Euros 4 weweeks ago, whenever that will be. I mean, it hasn't happened yet, but it might have happened by the time this goes out, because we're time traveling now.
And you just put the kibosh on everything. So
yes, I know.
When we go out, when we lose to Italy, which is almost inevitable, I'll be blaming you. I'll encourage everyone to blame you as well.
Good. Okay. Not everyone's interested in the Euros, even though we're slightly obsessed at the minute. Yes. We had our Book Lab episode last week, which I know will go down well because they always do. Of course, it goes without saying, you can get the back catalogue of the Book Lab episodes and all the podcast episodes, all the shows at selfpublishingformula.com. This week, we are back to our regular scheduled programming, and we have an expert to talk to today. His name is Jeff Elkins, and Jeff has become a bit of a guru about dialogue, about making it realistic, the purpose of dialogue, how to get it right. Such an important issue. Some people love it. I have to say I love it. And I think I said to Jeff at the beginning of the interview, I would happily write my entire book in dialogue. That's how I imagine the stories happening. Other people find it more tricky to get it right, and it leaps out the page. Sometimes I'm reading books, think it's not particularly realistic. There is an art to it, like every little aspect of writing. So without further ado, let's hear from Jeff.
This is the Self-Publishing Show. There's never been a better time to be a writer.
Jeff Elkins, welcome to the Self-Publishing Show. Great to have you here.
Thanks, James. It's great to be here.
Very exciting. We're talking about dialogue. We're going to be dialoguing about dialogue. I don't know if dialoguing is really an adjective we should use. But it's funny, we speak all the time. But when people come to write dialogues in novels, we know it's not quite the same as informal conversation. And it's an area that some people get tied up in knots about, and they don't like it. I love it, personally. I'd write my whole... I should be a screenwriter. I'd write my whole novel just in dialogue.
Yeah, I'm a fan of that style.
Yeah. And but some people I know, they struggle a little bit with it. So it's an area I think we're going to dissect tonight. But why don't we start, if you don't mind, with a little bit about you and your background, Jeff?
Yeah, sure. So I started writing around 2013, 2014. I hadn't really done any writing before then. And I started with just short stories as a stress relief from work. And then found myself in a really strange place in 2015. I got let go from a job and had 4 kids, a 5th kid on the way, and no way to make any money.
Scary.
Being let go from the job kind of wrecked my resume, made me a little unemployable at the time. So the only thing I could do was write. That was the only I felt like the only marketable skill I had. So I went to, I started cranking out novels as best I could, made a massive amount of mistakes, but started doing that. And thankfully, I also got picked up by a tech company who trains professionals from various walks of life in difficult conversations.
Oh.
And they, the woman who led the company had told me, like, hey, she's a friend and she'd been reading a bunch of my short stories. She's like, you're not traditionally trained in this area, but your short stories are good. Would you like to come on and lead our writing team? And so I did. I took the gig, and that was 7 years ago, and I've been obsessing over dialogue ever since. So it's been a wild ride. So 7 years, 11 novels later, and a whole ton of simulations that are pure dialogue in huge amounts of areas of different topics and areas in professional life written. And we hit 2020 and COVID hit, and I was trying to figure out kind of where my fiction career went next. And I happened to meet with Jay Thorne from the Author Success Mastermind and the Career Author. And I know you recently had him on the podcast.
Yeah.
He was great listening to him and Zach talk. So I met with him and was talking to him about, like, I don't know what the next step in my journey is. And so he took in my story. He was like, have you tried coaching people in dialogue? And I didn't really think of myself as a coach at the time. But I was like, yeah, I guess we could try that. Like, I did a ton of coaching in other areas of life, but not in writing. And so I launched the Dialogue Doctor in 2020 as a coaching service for writers to help them improve their dialogue. And it's been fantastic. It's really taken off. And I get to work with authors all the time. In the last year, I've been able to work with over 100 authors now on their work and helping them coach in dialogue. We've held multiple seminars on it, which has been really great, just to kind of help give people tools to use. We started a podcast that's going really well, and so that's me. I write, I coach on dialogue, and I'm having a great time doing it. It's a lot of fun.
Good. Well, let's talking in novels. And something that plagued me a little bit early on is I read somewhere you shouldn't have too much dialogue because it's weary. It's weary for the it's tiring for the reader. And that stifled me a lot when I was drafting early on, because I thought, but if people
makes me so sad.
What am I supposed to do? If people aren't talking, is to tell the reader what's happening. It's much better that they have a dialogue and a conversation. But I got over that, and I do use quite a lot of dialogue, and I haven't had anyone say to me I was too tired reading your book. So, but there is a way of writing dialogue that I think it isn't the way that you would converse to somebody necessarily in the house. Aaron Sorkin always says this. We say things in screenwriting and novels like, damn it. No one starts a sentence with damn it. Yeah. In real life, but you do in a novel, and there's a slightly different way of writing, isn't there, for fiction?
Yeah, and I'll just to talk to that some. I think this idea that, like, we're not supposed to be writing dialogue in novels like we do in the real world, in part is true. In that, like, in the real world, there's a lot of stumbling in conversation. There's a lot of kind of pointless meandering. Like, if you just analyze the conversations you're having with people, they don't necessarily have direction. They kind of go nowhere. There's lots of ums, like I just dropped in, and all that stuff. If you put all that stuff into a novel, it feels a little too much like real life, and the reader is reading to escape real life. So that aspect of it is true. I think we go too far in the other direction, though, which is to say, like, okay, so dialogue always has to serve plot, and that is also not true. This idea that, like, the purpose of dialogue is to only build the plot and that's it. The real purpose of dialogue, and what we get out of when we talk in real life, is emotional connection. So as community-based creatures, humans being kind of tribal creatures that connect with one another verbally, right? Like, is how we connect to other people. If you look at all the relationships you've had in life and you trace them, you can trace them back to a series of conversations between you and that person, whether it's your mother or your siblings or a romantic partner, right? Like, you can look at it and say, like, okay, we talked to each other, and that's how the relationship developed. The same is true with the characters in your novel and your reader, right? Your reader connects emotionally to your character and follows your character's emotional journey through the book by engaging with your character's dialogue. And so when we ask, like, what is dialogue for? That's what dialogue is for. Dialogue is for the conveyance of emotion and taking our reader on this emotional journey with our character, which is what readers are showing up for. Because, like I said, we're these tribal creatures, right? When we come to a novel, we're coming to connect with a character. We're coming to connect with that character's story, that character's journey. And the basis of that connection is that shared emotional experience. So in that, dialogue is one of the most important things you need to have in your story, because it creates that emotional tether between your reader and your characters. And it's what keeps readers coming back to your books. It's what keeps readers finishing your books, that they feel like they can emotionally unite with your character on this journey and be taken on this experience. So when people are like, well, you need to not have too much dialogue, I think they're missing the point of what dialogue is. right? Like dialogue is that emotional driver. So if you take it out and you don't have enough of it to communicate the emotional changes your character is experiencing, you're going to lose your readers' connection with your book. And they might admire your prose and they might admire the plot twists you have, but they're not going to go deeply invested in your book as they would if you had this deep if you had more dialogue that allowed them to take that journey with your character.
So very important dialogue. That's how I felt about the dialogue in my novel. I felt that was the point where people would understand the character in the same way that in real life somebody could describe you to me and I know I'm going to meet you on Tuesday. And so I'm going to think, I'll know on Tuesday. You can say all you want about Jeff's background and what he's like, and he's a nice guy, and the rest of it. I'll know when I speak to him.
Yeah. And I think because we've done ourselves a disservice as writers, because we've for years relegated dialogue to this secondary position behind plot, we've stopped thinking necessarily a lot about the tools that create great dialogue. So characterization often becomes relegated to background and into like how the character's background is going to develop the plot. And the skill of modulating a voice or creating a character voice and then modulating that voice throughout the piece in order to show emotional change is something we don't talk about often either. And it was weird, like, in my simulation experience where I'm writing difficult conversations all day, that's what we obsess over. Like in my training experience where I'm training professionals of all these different walks of life, we're obsessed over modulating voice, and we're obsessed over like how do we convey the emotional changes that are happening in a conversation second by second. And so when I came to writing novels and looked at it, I thought like, wow, I'm surprised we don't talk more about this.
Okay.
Because it is such a critical thing we can do in order to pull the reader into this journey we want to take them on.
Can you just break that down a little bit when you talk about modulating the voice?
Yeah, sure. So different areas of your life, different roles you play, different people you talk to, and different emotional states you have, you change how you talk. So, right, if you go to order a coffee from a barista, you're going to sound one way. But then if you walk away from that barista and get on the phone with your mom and you talk to your mom about a difficult topic, you're going to sound a little bit differently, right? Like with the barista, you may be casual, but not very vulnerable. But with your mother, when you're talking about a difficult conversation, let's say you become more heightened and intense. So your sentences get a little bit shorter. You get a little bit more abrupt. You ask less questions and make more declaratory statements. Then let's say you hang up the phone with your mom and you call your romantic partner to talk about the conversation you just had with your mother. And as you become more vulnerable, more open, your sentences get longer, you share more of them, you talk more, right? Like these are all just different modulations or expressions of your voice depending on the role or setting you're in and depending on who you're talking to. And as we listen to people talk about that kind of stuff, like as you watch TV, this is something that happens inherently in that you see people modulate their voice based on the emotional state that they're in. You see them change and you feel that emotion. You go on that emotional journey with them. That's happening in our novels as well. When people read the words we write, when they read our character voice, they're sensing the changes in that voice and what those changes and the body language we use to communicate dialogue, what those things emotionally are saying about our characters. And so if we can get strategic about modulating voice so that we can say like, okay, I want my character to seem angry and I want my reader to experience the intensity of that anger. So how can I modulate my character's voice right here in a very strategic way that builds up that emotion and then climaxes that emotion to take the reader on this emotional journey and leave them engaged with my character in this moment, right? Like, so that's what I mean by modulating voice is understanding the circumstances and the emotional state we want our character in and shaping their voice to match those circumstances and emotional state in order to communicate to the reader where we want our character to go.
That's really interesting. So those structural changes in the way that we speak, depending on the context of the conversation, you're saying something that we probably all do, but don't really analyze as writers and then employ that. I don't think I've ever properly worked out that I may do it naturally without thinking about it, but I haven't properly analyzed it like that.
It's part of the human condition. right? Like the expression of emotion through voice is part of something that we just do as people. So it does come naturally in our writing. But when I work with authors, I find that what they feel most often is they say, all of my characters sound the same. Right. Everybody sounds like me, which I've affectionately termed monomouth, meaning that like you have this disease where everybody sounds like the author sounds. And it can leave readers feeling like the text is a little bland and dry. And so part of this, being strategic about voice creation, part of that is diversifying voices. And then as we diversify the voices in our like palette that we're coloring with, because I think of voices as kind of colors that you're painting in your text. So if you imagine you're an oil painter and you've got this palette of colors, often as authors, we're all just painting with different shades of blue. And as we start to be specific about the voices we create, we're adding greens and yellows and reds, and the palette that we're painting on is becoming more and more expressive. Modulating voices is another way to start really creating this colorful, beautiful palette to paint with, because not everybody's voice modulates the same way. And this is why we need to be strategic about it, right? If you're a shy person who doesn't speak a lot in general, who is usually one of the last people to enter the conversation and does a lot of listening, when you get angry, you might be a stuffer who stuffs and stuffs and stuffs and then explodes. Right. Whereas if you're a super extroverted character who talks all the time, who likes to make jokes and who likes to laugh, when you start to get angry, you may be uncomfortable with that feeling because you like being the center of attention and you like everybody being happy. So your anger is going to be expressed in a completely different way than stuffing and exploding. You may be trying to make peace and trying to resolve that conflict, and that modulation in your voice will communicate to the reader that the character's emotion is changing, right? So the key to modulating voices, or the reason that we need to get strategic about it, is to ensure that we have that diversification of voices in our work to create that really vibrant palette that we're painting with, and also to make sure that we maintain voice consistency so that as a shy character modulates their voice, the reader can get used to like, oh, something's happening, they sound different. Right. And that's on a scene by scene level so that they can feel the change in emotion within a scene, and then on a whole work level so that they can feel the change in emotion across the entire novel. Right. So ideally, the voice is going to modulate scene by scene, but is also going to modulate across the novel as the character goes on this emotional journey.
Really interesting. So how would you advise us as novelists to go about ensuring our characters have their own way of speaking, their own dialogue? Is this in the way? And some people drop their characters' attributes to help them. One of those things, I guess, could be uses short, sharp sentences, doesn't speak very often. So to consider dialogue at that stage when you're drawing up your background attributes for your character.
Yeah. So a lot of times I'll ask writers like, tell me about your character's voice. And they'll go into telling me what I would describe as their character's background.
Yeah.
Right? They'll say like, well, they were orphaned as a young kid and they don't have parents, and they've really struggled with this sense of like feeling alone all the time. And I'll say like, that's fantastic. Those are great like roots or like, the background of the character, but how do they sound? And they'll go, well, because they were orphaned as a kid, and they're always, they're real quick to like take up for themselves, and they're real proud, and they carry this chip on their shoulder. And I'll say like, well, that's fantastic descriptions of their personality, but how does that sound? Right? Like what does that voice sound like? And so finally, as we work together, an author will go like, well, that chip on the shoulder means that like they declare a lot of things, and they're real quick to like state their opinion, and so that no one else can trample on them. And they're real fast to they jump into conversation quickly, and they always have a plan. They're real commanding. And I'll say like, okay, so now we're getting to voice, right? Declaratory statements, first to speak, sharp and forceful things, and saying a lot of plans. So when they talk about what they're talking about, they're taking charge in the conversation all the time, right? So now we have a voice. And once we get to that voice, then we can start talking about like how we modulate it based on like, so when they're afraid, how does that voice we have, what aspects of it are expressed and what aspects of it get suppressed when they're afraid, when they're happy and celebratory, what aspects of that voice get expressed and what gets suppressed, or when they're in a state of vulnerability where they're like opening up and sharing, do those declaratory statements stay? Or do they soften a little bit? Are they still talking about their plans? Or are they talking a little bit more open? And when we can start to shift voices that way, we start to create these intimate moments between our character and the reader where the reader's really feeling it. But going back to like the shift between understanding background and voice, a lot of times what we do as authors is we give that background or we give that personality, and then voice is assumed and it's in our head. So like a lot of authors I work with will have like pictures of actors for their characters. They're like, okay, so this character is like this actor. And I'll stop them and I'll be like, so just so we can remain consistent and we can really think about how the character sounds, when you say this character is like this actor, do you mean this character has the same background as this actor, or this character has the same personality as this actor, or this character is using phraseology and like pacing like this actor is using phraseology and pacing? And 9 times out of 10, I find that authors are like, well, I'm not sure. And the problem with I'm not sure isn't necessarily that they're doomed to write a bad book, right? Like that's not what I'm saying at all. The problem with I'm not sure is that they're going to struggle with consistency as the work gets longer. Because they start to, if we haven't settled on what a voice sounds like and we don't hear that character voice in our head as we're writing, we start to revert back to our own voice over time. And so it just creates an editing process over and over. So a lot of authors I work with will be like, I don't even think about character voice. I write an entire draft just knowing that monomouth is going to be my problem. And then I have to go back and do a whole second draft where I'm thinking about character voice. And for me, it's like, hey, we can save you time and drafting if we can just, after you write, even if you're a pantser who doesn't like to plan anything, let's get 6,000 words down and then let's just pause and look at them and define the character voice that you're writing here. And if we can do that, we can save you time over the long haul, because as writers, I find that once we define the character voice, we've got it. Right? Like I have yet to meet a writer who's like, I've defined the character voice and I'm struggling to keep it through the book. Like once we get it, we can write it. So like once you can hear it in your head, you tend to be able to translate it to the page. And the key is to take that extra step and define it and really get to the place where you've got that voice locked into your mind, and it'll translate on the page for you. At a minimum, it's going to be a lot easier to edit in the next couple of drafts.
Do you have a suggested method of getting that dialogue, of noting it to yourself, and how would you help yourself stick to those dialogue attributes, bearing in mind, as you say, once you've got them you then have to work out how to modulate them? But
yeah, so I use a chart because I'm an obsessive Excel guy. And you can go to dialoguedoctor.com and get it for free from our website. We call it a character wheel chart. And what it does is it gives you, the rows are characters and the columns are character background, character personality, notes on the character personality. And then we have you fill out what's called a baseline voice, which is like, this is the voice that we're most often going to relate to this character. And then after we do the baseline voice, then we say like, so think about the ways you think this character voice might change throughout the book. And then we just create a column for each change. And we write like just the little notes in there on how that voice might change for each book, for each scene. So for me, I chart it. But if you're not a charter, and I like the charting it because it allows me to compare and contrast character voices. So I can like look at my protagonist and I can say like, okay, my protagonist voice sounds like this. And then I have this ally next to my protagonist. So let's say I was J.R. Tolkien and I'm like, okay, I've got Frodo's voice down. He's very measured. He's very systematic with what he says. He's a big observer. He's watching the world around him. He doesn't talk a lot. And when he does talk, he expresses a lot of personal fears, right? Like, so the content of his talk is a lot of fears and he questions some. Now I need to build an ally with him, right? Like I need to have somebody that's going to be on his side. When I put it in a chart, I can look down at Sam and be like, okay, how's Sam's voice going to sound different so that I'm not writing two Frodos talking to each other all the time, because that's going to be a really boring conversation. How can I make Sam different? And at the same time, how can I make Sam a complement to Frodo so that they would sound like two people that would talk together? So like, how can I build voices that complement and contrast one another to create a more dynamic conversation, right? Like the chart allows me to look at my voices so that I can line them up and say like, okay, I know these two people are going to talk a lot, and I want to build voices that are naturally going to complement one another and create some tension between each other. So like with Sam, I'm going to build, if I were Tolkien, I'd be like, I'm going to build a voice that also is very measured and also only speaks when it really has something to say, but is more of an emotional vomiter. Right. Like, and when they get to this state where they have to say something, they're just going to vomit. And this is going to create some great tension between Frodo and Sam, because Frodo's going to want to stay guarded and reserved and keep everything inside. And Sam's going to push him all the time to have this like emotional moment where he forces Frodo to kind of process emotionally what's going on. So that's why I use a chart, because I can look at all the voices and line it up. Other ways to do it, though, are just to take a piece of paper and write down 4 to 5 words that describe your character's voice and keep it somewhere where you can see it. And when I say words that describe your character's voice, right, as authors, we have limited tools. We have short words or long words, short sentences or long sentences, content of the focus of that thing, and then common body language that character is going to use. If you can answer those 4 questions, you're on a really great start to defining a character voice.
It sounds like it's quite a lot of work, which is fine. Writing a novel does involve a lot of work, and people happily do other aspects of this. What are the main benefits of getting this dialogue nailed so that your characters have their own voice?
Yeah, so the point of all of this, because it's not work for work's sake, right? Like we don't want to just generate, like you said, writing a novel is hard enough. Like the last thing we need to do is make it harder. So this is about engaging the reader, right? We know that the reader engages through dialogue. That's why a reader grabs in. And when I first started this, I was super skeptical, because I was like, I know I engage through dialogue, and I know that when I read and you give me a block of prose, I tend to skim it. And if you give me pages of prose, I get bored about halfway through, and then I like start looking for the next, like when's actually something. And the way it gets phrased in my mind is, when is something going to happen? Right? Because dialogue is action. So as our reader reads dialogue, they're reading action. It is a doing, not a telling. It's a showing, not a telling, right? Like when readers read dialogue, they're being shown something, not told something. And so we know that, and like we know that as writers, that we need to show, not tell. But I was skeptical when I first started writing. So I went and got a ton of masterworks. Like I got bestsellers from all different genres, and I took a highlighter. And I just started highlighting, like, how much are we dialoguing and how much are we prosing? And I was shocked to find that the books that we find most engaging, the ones that we buy the most often and read the most often, they are by far majority dialogue, right? Like some of them 80 to 90% dialogue. And just the prose is really just something that pushes you into the next scene, but every scene is full of dialogue and characters interacting with each other in that way. So the thing that dialogue brings to our work is that reader engagement, which leads to reader read through, which leads to readers engaging in our series long term, right? Like if we're writing great dialogue, it is one of the aspects that sells a book. Right? Like it's not the aspect that sells a book. There's also marketing and covers, as you and Mark talk about all the time and teach so eloquently. But having great dialogue is part of what maintains reader sustainability in our books. So like great dialogue is going to keep readers coming back and keep them reading into the next series. That's the primary reason for focusing on dialogue, is to get that reader engagement. Because that's what we're after, right?
Yeah.
Like we want readers to love our work and keep coming back to it. And that comes through that connection and character.
And I imagine that engagement comes not just from getting to know the characters, but also the fact that they can very easily in the conversation work out who's talking, which sometimes is difficult. Yeah. And we end up saying he said, she said, and wondering as an author, do I have to say again, this is who's talking? And that may be a result of us not really differentiating the way people speak.
Yeah, Differing voices very much helps with that. The other thing it helps with is that like emotional entanglement between the reader and the character. And if we have a diversity of voices, right? Like if all our voices sound different, what's nice about that is that we're opening our reader up to having other avenues to connect to our work. So if our reader finds like they don't like our protagonist's voice, if we have strong diversity of voices, they have other options to emotionally engage with, which is also a benefit.
So we've got our structure going into this, and then writing the book itself. How do we check? How do we edit ourselves on this and make sure that we've achieved this? Do you have a methodology? Is it simply a case of reading it back to yourself, reading it out loud?
I actually don't read out loud. I know that helps, and it can help to read out loud, but I find that when I read out loud, I'm just hearing myself talk.
Right.
So it's very difficult because I'm a terrible actor. It's very difficult for me to actually read in another voice. And there's a lot of different ways we can go about this. So let me just give you some quick things that I do. One thing that I'll do if I have a finished scene is I'll open it up in Word, which is what I usually write in. And then I will take my cursor and I will highlight in a specific color every character's voice. So character A might be blue, and then character B might be green, and then character C might be yellow. And then in my first pass, and for a 2,000 word scene, usually takes me about 7 minutes just to go through and highlight. Because I'm not reading, I'm just looking for the words they say and the body language they use to communicate how they're interacting with another character, right? So if there's first person inner thoughts, I leave the inner thoughts out. If there's descriptions of scenes, I leave the descriptors out. If there's somebody reflecting on like what's happening in the room, or at some point I'm telling the reader how a character's feeling, I leave that out. I'm just looking for the direct person-to-person interactions. I'm highlighting those different colors for each character, and then I'm just going to go through and read the colors one at a time. I'm just going to read the blue. And I'm going to be like, is this voice consistency, and do these blue lines sound like I want this character to sound? Then I'm going to go through and read all the yellow. Then I'm going to go through and read all the green. And then after I've corrected each individual voice, then I can come back and read the piece as a whole, right? Like, so that's just a cheap, quick trick. It's going to add like 30 to 40 minutes to editing a scene. But if you've got a scene where you've got like 3 or 4 characters talking and you read it and you're like, man, this just doesn't feel right. Like a lot of times it's hard for us to diagnose what's going on. And what we get is like, this doesn't feel right. Or I'm not getting the emotions I want to get out of this. It doesn't feel like I want it to feel. It's likely you're losing character voice in there somewhere. So highlighting those voices, reading through them is a great trick. Another trick I'll have is I will read through it and again, only read the parts where people are talking. So I'll remove all the other words and I'll just read the back and forth. And that reading the back and forth is great if we have just 2 characters in a scene. Because reading that back and forth will let you know if the dialogue is actually conveying everything it needs to convey. Or a lot of times with others, I find that we skip steps because we're so plot focused and we're so like prose focused. We end up missing moments in dialogue. And if we just read the back and forth, we realize like, oh, this doesn't make any sense unless one of the characters gives us this transition into the next piece. If I have a scene that I'm really, really struggling with, right? Like a scene that just doesn't work, I'll actually change my process. And I say change my process. I used to change my process. This is actually how I write all the time now. But I'll write what I know many people call a dialogue only first draft, which is you just write what the characters say back and forth. It looks a little like a screenplay in that like, well, recently I was writing one between 2 characters I'm writing right now, Tuck and Rudy. So all you have on the page for the first draft is T, and then I have what Tuck says. R, I have how Rudy responds. T, what Tuck says. R, how Rudy responds. I'll get the whole scene written that way, because that forces me to put dialogue primary and forces me to move the piece through the characters talking to one another. And then after I've written my first scene that way, I'll come back and I'll add all the additional bits and pieces that we usually write with writing, like Tuck leaned forward and looked Rudy in the eye and said, and then I have what Tuck said there. and then I'll put in what Rudy said, and then like as he crossed his arms, right? And then I'll have Tuck laughed, and then I'll have what he said, and then I'll have Rudy's response, and then I may have Tuck's response, and then I can put in, some other body language for Rudy that helps me. Can be like Rudy sipped his coffee, paused for a moment, and then responded, right? Like, so what that does is it forces me to keep my dialogue central in the piece, and forces me to really focus in on that emotional conveyance between the two characters. If you're struggling with a scene that has characters in it and it's just not landing like you want it to land, I just recommend sometimes, hey, let's rewrite it so that it's dialogue first, and then we can come back and look at the rest of this prose that you want to add back in.
And do you use that technique as a first draft technique, or is this only to come back to scenes where you're struggling?
When I first started writing, it used to be an editing technique where I'd like take a scene that I was really struggling with and rewrite it as an editing technique. But now I do it as a first draft. I write all of my drafts that way. And I actually didn't come up with that. Jay Thorne taught it to me because he had learned it from somebody else. And I was like, oh, I'm doing this as an editing technique. I don't first draft this way. And so I started first drafting that way. And that wasn't entirely true. I had decided at one point, I think this was like 2018. I was like, I'm going to write a book that is only dialogue. Just see if I can pull it off. And so I wrote a book that's a series of 9 conversations.
Wow.
It was just to see if I could do it. And, it went okay.
Yeah.
Yes. But all that to say, it's a technique that a lot of people use. It's not one I came up with, but if you're struggling with your character voice, I highly recommend it because it forces you just to focus on those interactions between characters, especially if you're an author that likes to write inner thoughts. So if you're an author that adds a lot of inner thoughts, write the scene without them and then put them back in as flavor. Right? Like get your meat and potatoes on the plate. And then after you've cooked your meat and potatoes, add all the gravy you want to. But if we can get that solid, first draft of dialogue in, we can then come back and spice it up later.
Great. I think you may have offered to put some stuff together for us, Jeff.
So I put together for you a 10-minute teaching on character voice and what character voice actually is to help. Because again, like I find that a lot of times writers don't, when we say like we need to focus on character voice, they don't even fully get what that is because we just haven't talked about it enough. So we use an illustration at the Dialogue Doctor called the Dialogue Daisy. That describes character voice as a flower, and a flower in 4 different pieces. So I put together a video that talks about it just for your crew. And
great.
Yeah, it's just it's hidden behind a secret YouTube link.
Okay.
So.
Well, we can hand that secret YouTube link out if you go to selfpublishingformula.com/dialogue. Now, let me just check. Dialogue is spelled the same in the US as it is in the UK. It's not one of those words. It doesn't have we have a U in dialogue, right?
Yeah, we have a U in dialogue.
Yeah,
DIALOGUE.
There's only one way of spelling it. Good. I got caught out the other day. I think the honourable was the word I was talking to a friend about and realised it's spelled differently. You spell it incorrectly, of course.
Of course. Yeah, I fully agree with that.
Well, look, that sounds great. This is clearly, it's so interesting in this industry that we're in that some people, I think, don't need instruction in some areas. They just innately get it and they can't explain it to you. And other areas, they really struggle to master it. And whichever area you focus on, you can spend a day, a week, a month talking about just this one area. So it can become a bit overwhelming, but dialogue is so important. I think you've really underlined why. And if that readability thing, that's so important in a book, making it easy to read, easy to understand. So people get to the good stuff, right? What your story is about, what your characters are doing, not having to wade through who was talking then and what's happening here. And if you can, I think that differentiation of character, that character voice is so important in making your book engaging, as you say. I think you said that right at the beginning. So important.
Yeah. And I think we want those moments, right? Like we want that moment to go back to Tolkien, we want that moment of Frodo and Sam at the cliff where Frodo's debating whether or not he's going to throw the ring into the fire. We want to feel the pain of that moment. And we want our reader to feel, Sam weeping and Sam screaming, like, don't do it. And the struggle that Frodo's having, right? But that struggle comes through dialogue. And so if we don't have the dialogue, we rob our reader of that experience. We can describe that moment all we want to, but unless we like pull them into the moment and get super intimate with the reader, we're going to lose it. And that intimacy comes through that dialogue. So I think the exciting thing about investing in dialogue for somebody who hasn't is that it's going to open up a whole new level of emotional depth to your work.
Great.
That you may not have experienced before.
Okay, so we'll give away that secret teaching at selfpublishingformula.com/dialogue. And Jeff, where can people find you and find out more about this?
Yeah, so they can come find me at thedialoguedoctor.com. That's kind of where the central hub is of everything. We do a podcast every week. That is me and other people talking about dialogue and teaching on dialogue. And then there's a newsletter that comes out on Tuesday and a Patreon bonus episode that comes out on Wednesdays. So all of that's available for people to grab at dialoguedoctor.com.
Superb. Jeff, it's been compelling talking to you.
Thanks for having me, James. It's
dialoguing with
fantastic.
you. Yes. No, it's our pleasure. Yeah. And we'll have you back at some point and go over this again and perhaps do a specific exercise and maybe even a webinar on this subject at some point. I think that'd be a good thing. We're a bit stacked at the moment, but we will definitely come back to this. I think it's such an important project. Are you going to conferences? Are you going to be doing any live teaching at any point? People catch you?
Yeah, I'm speaking at coming up. I'm speaking at the Successful Author
Summit.
I think a summit. Yeah, thank you. The Career Author Summit. That's the name of it. Jay and Zach have too many names for things. I get lost. The Career Author Summit in September in Nashville. I have Sasha Black and I are doing a conference for the Vancouver Island Romance Writers Association later in. I think that one's in October. We'll be talking about craft there too. And then there's some other, kind of fun projects we have coming up this summer. We got 2 books releasing in the fall on dialogue exercises. That'll be fun. And then maybe some special podcast stuff happening in July, which will be great too.
Cool. Sounds like you're as busy as we are. The only way to be.
Yeah.
Jeff, thank you so much indeed. Thank you for joining us and have a great rest of the day.
Yeah, thanks so much, James.
This is the Self-Publishing Show. There's never been a better time to be a writer.
Do you like the dialogue bit, Mark? Is it something you look forward to in your book? They're the bits that it comes alive for you, or are you more somebody who likes some of the descriptive, being in someone's head bit?
No, I think dialogue is great. It's one of my favorites. And often when I get stuck, I'm drafting at the moment, writing this 20th Milton book, and I'm going all over the place, so it's not sequential at the moment. I'm kind of going forwards and backwards and all kinds of different directions. And I'll often start with a dialogue line. So a character will be saying something, and then I fill it the rest of it out from there. So it's often my starting point. But yeah, dialogue's fun. Yeah, it's one of the more entertaining parts of the process.
Yeah, someone once said to me very early on when I was attempting to draft a book. Someone said, "Oh, you can't have too much dialogue. It wears out the reader." I wasn't really sure what that means, but I have quite a lot of dialogue, and my editors have not said a thing to me about having too much dialogue.
I don't know. I don't think it depends how you do it. I mean, you look at someone like Elmore Leonard, who's one of my favorite writers, and he's well known for his dialogue. It's one of the things he's most famous for, and there'll be lots and lots of dialogue. I certainly don't get tired reading his books. Not at all. It's fun, and it is a skill. It's when you're in the hands of a writer who knows what they're doing. When it comes to something like that, it's the pages just fly by. So no, I don't really buy that. Unless if you're bad at it, then of course you'll tire the reader out. But hopefully, with practice, most of us can be fairly decent when it comes to writing dialogue.
Yeah,
he said.
Good.
Angrily.
Yeah. Take out all your adjectives.
Exactly.
Okay, look, thank you very much indeed to our guest today, Jeff Elkins. I hope you found that episode useful. Thank you very much indeed to our Patreon supporters. We will welcome some more next week, patreon.com/self-publishing show. And I think that's it, Mark. We can actually go on the holiday that we've had by the time this goes out. We can do that. I'm going to go to Devon tomorrow.
Yeah, and I'm going to Suffolk on Saturday, so absolutely. We're all there.
We couldn't be further apart, Mark.
We could.
When are we having our golfing holiday?
Oh, I don't know. Are you sure you're up to it? I'm getting better.
Well, I think we need to have one sooner. I am taking my clubs. I found a way of strapping them to the roof. So I'm taking my clubs.
I'm not taking
mine. Yeah, we need to have a golfing holiday at some point. Okay, good. Thank you very much indeed. All that remains for me to say is that it's a goodbye from him.
And a goodbye from me. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Get show notes, the podcast archive, and free resources to boost your writing career at selfpublishingshow.com. Join our thriving Facebook group at selfpublishingshow.com/Facebook. Support the show at patreon.com/selfpublishingshow. And join us next week for more help and inspiration so that you can make your mark as a successful indie author. Publishing is changing, so get your words into the world and join the revolution with The Self-Publishing Show.